Cool.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeremy Crones. I'm a senior anthropology major at the University of Maryland, and this program has been in my mind since I was a freshman, and I'm very excited to finally have been a part of it. Today I'm going to be talking about cultural change through climate change and traditional ecological knowledge. So the first, I want to go over the issue, climate change. I don't want to get political. I don't want to argue whether climate change is happening, whether it's anthropogenic or not. We're going to accept, at least for this presentation, that climate change is happening. Climate change research is dominated by two main fields. One is politics. There are a variety of organizations, both domestic and international, that research climate change, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the United States EPA, and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The second are the physical sciences. Climate change is researched through ecology, geology, biology, hydrology, any of the harder sciences that Kyle is interested in and all of us didn't like in high school. But what is missing? What about the social sciences? Social sciences are sociology and anthropology and psychology. These are sciences, and geography. These are sciences that aren't emphasized as well in our public schools, but are still very important because they deal with people, and people are obviously a very large part of our world. I don't know which screen to look at here. Okay. So the social sciences and the social sciences and climate change. I was using a book by Grossman and Parker called Asserting Native Resilience. Asserting Native Resilience was written for the Pacific Northwest up and through Canada, up through to Alaska, about climate change effects on native populations. There were two quotes that I took from this book that hit me the hardest. The first is that indigenous peoples around the world are often viewed as canaries in a mine shaft. It's generally accepted, at least in this book, that indigenous peoples, Native Americans, First Peoples, Aboriginals, all around the world are the most closely connected cultures to nature and to the natural cycles of the earth. They are the observers, they are the victims, they are the mitigators, and they are the adapters to climate change. They feel it first because their economies are most closely connected to the fishery system, to the hunting system, and to basic agricultural systems. The second is that in the early documents that the United States government made with Native American tribes around the continental US use the words "as long as the rivers run" in two ways. The first way was to describe the length of the relationship, between the very close and consensual relationship between the United States government and these native populations. They said, we will be friends for as long as the rivers run. They also said that the agreements would last that long. It accepted that the rivers would run at a relatively fixed state of time, or fixed state of being, where the rivers would always run, the water was taken for granted, because, as we learned from Kyle, it's a closed loop and the water won't go anywhere. Unfortunately, as our class watched Chasing Water by Pete McBride, which he was a local from Colorado who studied the Colorado River and followed it all the way out to the bay, or at least as close as he could get, he learned that the Colorado River doesn't run that long anymore. It's drying up, it doesn't reach the ocean. And I found that to be incredibly symbolic of the relationships the United States government has with the Native Americans and a lot of the treaties we've made. Throughout this presentation, I'll be going through definitions and asking certain questions after each definition. I hope that everyone will participate. So the first definition we're going to go through, and I'm just going to gloss over it, is climate change. I hope to assume that everyone here at least has an understanding of climate change. Climate change are alterations in the global environment and changes in the extreme. As we learn from Bill DeBees, climate change has three significant components. The first is that the hotter and drier areas of the world will become hotter and drier. The colder and wetter areas of the world will become colder and wetter. And the areas of the world that have variations will become more variable. So along the East Coast, Maryland and New York and New Jersey used to get the prevailing rains and winds from the hurricanes, but now those are getting worse. Likely in the Southwest, the droughts will be getting worse, and the variations of monsoon rains to the drought seasons will be getting more variable. A comic I found that struck home to me, especially for this presentation and research, was done by Chris Madden. It's a man with his head in the sand saying, burying my head in the sand over climate change is so much easier now that half the world has turned to desert. So the question now are, what are some key regions that we know about that are significantly affected by climate change? I already mentioned a couple.
Southwest.
The Southwest. Antarctica. Let's get two more. China, Middle East. All right, so all of these are significant areas of the world greatly affected by climate change. And all of them, except for Antarctica, have native populations. We're going to focus, obviously, on the American Southwest. The American Southwest is the region defined from the Four Corners down to the southern end of Chihuahua, Mexico. The map, Four Corners, is located... different scale. Four Corners is located there, down to about central Mexico is the American Southwest. So, who is affected in this region? Who are the stakeholders? This is a question. Colleen.
Obviously the people who live here.
People who live here. Can you break that down?
Indigenous people.
Indigenous people.
Land managers.
Hmm?
Land managers.
Land managers like Jacob. Other park service. Ranchers.
Yeah.
Wildlife. They're definitely stakeholders.
Hikers.
And hikers. That's good. So that's a very nice group. The first one that was said was indigenous people. One of those groups of indigenous people are the Navajo. The Navajo Nation is a federal reservation in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Map of the Southwest. I'm going to focus right on the Four Corners region. This is a map, skewed map of the Navajo Nation and the surrounding area. We're here in Flagstaff. We've driven through Cameron, past Tuba City, through the Hopi Reservation. Now, two key terms that I used in my research are traditional knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. Traditional knowledge is a body of understanding acquired through experiential and spiritual learning. This is anything from the legends and myths of a significant culture or going out into the field and learning this and passing it down through the generations. Traditional ecological knowledge is traditional knowledge that is specifically focused in ecology. One video that Wolf showed me was called Red Bird Saves the Corn. And this was done by a group of, there was a video on YouTube done by a group of students out of Loop who decided to tell a story that one of their grandmothers had told them about the small village of Navajo whose corn was always dying. And so they sent one boy, Redbird, to go find Spider Woman, who is a significant holy figure in Navajo. Through a series of trials and tribulations, he found Spider Woman and she said, go and plant this flower. It's a yellow flower called zinnia. And zinnia flowers, she said, go plant this next to your corn and next season your corn will flourish. So he went back and planted it and the next year his corn flourished. That might just seem like a legend to us, but in actuality zinnia flowers attract hummingbirds and other predatory insects that eat the insects that feed on corn and other crops. And while the Navajo might not have known that science, that is considered traditional ecological knowledge because they understood the beneficial relationship between companion planting. So now we're going to get personal. What is your TEK? How do you define your personal TEK from your own culture or your family or your region? Emily?
Everything's connected.
Everything's connected?
Everything we do affects everything. If you leave the shower on too long, it drains a little bit of the fresh water in your kitchen.
All right. Vanessa?
My grandma grows a lot of herbs and aloe vera in her garden.
Mm-hmm.
So if we get burns or if I have stomach ache, she just takes it out from her garden and mixes it and gives it to me in a tea.
That's right. So that one, out of all of the three, is most significantly indigenous because it comes, like Celine talked about, it doesn't come from pharmaceuticals, but it comes from a history and by your elders. So now, how could your TEK be affected by climate change? How could the herbs in Vanessa's grandmother's garden be affected by a warming climate, especially in Texas and Mexico? How could, oh, Celine, go ahead.
I would say jobs, definitely, because if there's no water for the plants, it's gonna die.
That's right.
Also, if these herbs are planted in a wet place, the
it's possible that the increased precipitation will drown them.
Mhm.
Drown.
That's right.
Will be alterations to the growing season.
That's right. So different herbs will grow at different times. Maybe the pollinators won't pollinate. So now, one case study that I looked at briefly was on Aeolian sand dunes in Navajo. Aeolian sand dunes are hills made from wind-driven sand currents. And this was research done by Margaret Redsteer-Hiza of USGS and a variety of professors here at NAU. Aeolian sand dunes are formed, wind direction is blowing, and as the leeward wind is passing through, it pushes sand back into the hill, and it moves very quickly, Aeolian sand dunes. Sorry. A little bit of history is that was a Greek god, Aeolus, who was the Greek god of the wind. This is a map produced by the USGS of Aeolian sand dunes and their movements in the American Southwest. We are here, that's Flagstaff, that is the Four Corners region. You can see that I didn't put a Navajo map on here, but that region, as we recognized from before, is the Navajo area where a lot of the reservations are. Part of the research that they did, they studied a family in Tisto, which is in the Navajo Nation. They were living not necessarily in a very residential area, and they realized that the sand dunes were moving in fast. That's a picture of their house, and that's an outhouse that's covered about a third by the sand. So what happens when these sand dunes move into this residential area? What do people think will happen? We'll bury the houses, right. If you don't have a lot of money, as Emily and others have pointed out, Navajo Nation is plagued by poverty. If you don't have a lot of money or a lot of capabilities by the federal government, how will you be able to move your home successfully away from the sand into a safe area? Another issue, however, is also their culture. Navajo and other Native Americans of this region have significant cultural ties to the specific land on which their houses are built. So if the sand dunes come in and force them to leave, they're leaving behind some of their own culture and their TEK. So the biggest question of my presentation and of today is what can be done? What can we do in the future to help mitigate the effects that climate change has upon Native cultures around the world, and specifically in the Southwest? I'm going to open it up and see if anyone has some ideas. Kate?
I think that people who aren't as rich and people who don't have as many resources are the ones who are most affected by climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And so mitigating that aspect of Indigenous people's lives would be a huge factor.
All right. Sully?
I'd say it's all about education. We will educate our peers, younger people about conserving water and energy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one small step, but it can go a long way in the long run.
Sure, to slow down climate change at least. Yeah. Vanessa?
I like Celine's idea that that's a great long-term solution, but also we could get a lot of scientists together and decision makers to do short-term solutions. That way we won't wait for 50 years before there's a tangible solution.
That's right. So that's the biggest point that I found as well, is to tie in the science and the policy from before in my presentation with the anthropology and the sociology to say, look, it's not only the Gila lizard that's being affected, it's not only the coal-fired power plants that are influencing the climate, it's also the people in the area, and we need to start teaching our kids early about the anthropological effects of climate change and of the world and our own actions. So that concludes my presentation for now. My research, I feel that this semester, I'm inspired to say this, the conversation with Wayne, this semester was incredibly inspirational for me. It opened me up to the American Southwest and the climate, both political and actual climate of the American Southwest. And I feel that this semester put a strain on me to help balance my experiential passions with my educational passions, and I hope to pursue that in the future. Thank you. If there's time, does anyone have any questions for me? Celine.
So what sort of change would you suggest that us here in the room take with us to our state, and how we share that with our peers?
Okay, so much like the other presentations that we've seen today, especially Katie's, which is why I asked her this question, is that the issues that I pointed out here are relevant to every state in the United States and around the world. So bringing home the education, or at least the drive to educate other people about these issues and about how climate change doesn't only affect the birds and the bees, but it also affects people, would be incredibly poignant to help adapt policymakers to move in that direction. Yes?
Do you have any ethical considerations for manipulating climate change?
Can you expand?
Well, I mean, if you make some alterations in something that, building dams
Mhm.
to contain water, so you're going to deal with the fact that you're getting more rains, and they're coming at a more frequent period of time, maybe with the same intensity, maybe with more. That's what I'm dealing with. Our rains for the year, like say, they did 20 years ago, they're closer together, and the soil can't accept all of that water.
Okay.
So they were open to flooding. We flooded a lot in the Midwest, Mississippi and Missouri. So we build higher dams, or we do something, and that alters what happens with climate change. What do you see then as the ripple effect? Or do you?
No, part of my changes this semester was accepting different philosophies, especially on the environment. And while deep down in my heart I say it's people's own fault for living in flood zones and for living in environmentally precarious situations, I recognize the importance of protecting the society that we have. I find that my own solution to it would be to work slower with the mitigators and the adapters of climate change and the people who feel the effects most, is just to work slow so everyone has time to adapt to what's happening. Progress and development must happen. It's the way of the Western world and the way of America. But if we do take a step back for every 2 steps that we take forward, I feel that everyone at least should be able to understand the matchup that we make. Does that appeal to your question?
Somehow there's an effect somewhere you have to weigh.
Yeah, the pros and cons of building a dam to affect the river, but it also protects the people who live downstream of the river.
You've lost land for productive people.
Right.
On the other side.
Right.
You take
And-
away their culture.
Yeah, it's we're dealing with that here with the dams on the Colorado River. It's a precarious situation. I'm sorry. Okay, well, thank you very much. Oh, right.
That was a stop sign.
Next up is Jess Butler, and she's going to be talking about the Grand Canyon Semester Research Seminar.
That is not what I'm going to be talking about. That's all right. Okay. My name is Jessica Butler, and I am actually presenting on Bridging the Gap, Public Involvement in the Stakeholder Processes of Grand Canyon National Park Management. In 1933, George Wright said, "Our national heritage is richer than just scenic features. The realization is coming that perhaps our greatest national heritage is nature itself, with all its complexity and its abundance of life, which, when combined with great scenic beauty as it is in the national parks, becomes of unlimited value." Now, others have gone on to say that the Grand Canyon National Park specifically is our nation's most valuable landscape. So, who is it that values the Grand Canyon? There are over 4.5 million visitors to the Grand Canyon every year, coming from all around the world. There are over a dozen tribes, such as the Havasupai and Wallapai, that have ties to the Grand Canyon. There are over 135,000 residents that share Coconino County with the park, and there's over 10 million individuals that depend on the Colorado River and for its water and other resources. As the Grand Canyon is one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, there are millions more than just these statistics that value the Grand Canyon. So what is it that makes it so valuable? Some might say that the wildlife and the biodiversity of the canyon make it valuable. Others might say the recreational opportunities or the history that it provides through archaeology and geology. Now, I'd like everyone for a minute to think about what they find valuable about the Grand Canyon. And if anyone would like to volunteer what they find valuable.
Nature.
Like the history of it.
The knowledge it gives us.
Lack of development. Yeah, nature.
The opportunity to remove yourself from civilization. Yeah.
As you can see, there are a lot of different things that people value about the Grand Canyon, and this is only a small portion of the millions of people that value it. However, sometimes there are conflicts in what we value, especially when there's development, mining, and overflights in the canyon. These are some of the conflicting values. So in the end, who is it that chooses what is valuable? Now, the National Park Service are these people. They are the ones that make the land management decisions for the park. In addition, regional land managers also have impacts on this. They choose what is valuable about their own lands and make decisions based on that. And in turn, those decisions directly impact the park as well. In addition, stakeholders also have an impact on this. While land managers ultimately make the decisions, stakeholders also have an influence on this. Stakeholders are the groups or individuals that are impacted by land management decisions, and in turn are sought out to provide insight. The Park Service and other land managers use stakeholders to create a more holistic management plan. This is used to create well-rounded management and representative management. So just to visualize this relationship, you have the National Park Service, which are the land managers in this situation. And then you have the stakeholders. You have government agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service. You have Native American tribes such as the Havasupai, and as well as members of the scientific and nonprofit communities. These are impacted by the decisions made by the national park, and in turn they provide the insight to make those decisions. Now, the Greater Grand Canyon Landscape Assessment is the landscape assessment that I used as a case study for my research. National Park Service and other land managers use landscape assessments to make science-based decisions. Now, the GGCLA is modified from typical landscape assessments. It combines scientific knowledge, current information, and cultural knowledge. In addition to just assessing natural resources like typical land assessments do, it also assesses the conditions for cultural resources. It puts a heavy emphasis on stakeholder involvement, and the boundaries are not determined by the bureaucratic lines of the national park, but instead follow watershed boundaries to have a better and positive impact on the ecosystem. Now, the GGCLA process can be thought of as in two streams. One stream is a flow of 3 stakeholder workshops that help to determine what are the most valuable aspects of the canyon as well as what are the greatest threats. The other stream to this would be this compilation of scientific data. Now, these streams can be thought of as having interlocking tributaries in the sense that the stakeholders provide insight on what scientific data should be compiled, and also the scientific data that's compiled has an influence on stakeholder decisions. In the end, all of this will be compiled and presented to the National Park Service to provide insight on what areas of the park should receive more conservation management. Now, I was able to work with Dr. Tom Sisk and Sasha Stortz on this project and attend the first of the 3 GGCLA stakeholder workshops, which was held on October 11th. Now, there were 56 stakeholders who attended this workshop from 22 different organizations, everything from government organizations to nonprofits. For this landscape assessment, the Grand Canyon region was divided into 3 zones, that being above the rim, below the rim, and river corridor, to provide better and more specific land management. For example, if a value such as vegetation would be considered a value below the rim, it might not be considered value above the rim. And having these separations allows for those distinctions to be made. From there, the stakeholders went on to discuss what values and threats to each region. Lists of these values and threats were compiled, and the stakeholders then voted on what the top 6 most important threats and the top 6 most important values were for this region. Now, when I attended this workshop, I was really taken back by the fact that there were 56 individuals in a single room that were going to have such a huge impact on the future of the Grand Canyon. And so I wanted to know, as the canyon is such an invaluable place to so many, were the decisions being made by these stakeholders, the values and threats that they chose, were these representative of the larger body of individuals that find the Grand Canyon valuable? So I posed the question of, with non-stakeholders, what would they value and what would they see as threats, and would these be different from stakeholders? So I decided to do a workshop of my own for non-stakeholders. I use the same methods as the GGCLA workshop in that I use the above the rim, below the rim, and river corridor distinctions. I also use the same voting system of having the participants choose the top 6 values and the top 6 threats. But instead of stakeholders, I chose to use Grand Canyon semester students as my participants. I chose to use this group because they are an educated group of students that have been studying the Grand Canyon for its values and its issues over the past 4 months. In addition, they represent a wide portion of the country, coming from California to Pennsylvania, bringing with them a broad range of perspectives. In addition, I couldn't do what I would prefer to do, which would be to sample the general public. That would take too much time and be beyond my resources. So not only did I want to look at the differences and similarities between what the 2 workshops voted on, I also wanted to look at the discussions between each group. So I represented this through Venn diagrams, showing the similarities and differences between the topics of discussion. So looking at this Venn diagram to explain it, GCS had 7 topics that were unique in this specific discussion that were not brought up in the GGCLA workshop. However, there were 16 topics that were similar between both workshops. So overall, what this slide is telling you is for when discussing values of the Grand Canyon, you have above the rim, below the rim, and river corridor. As you can see, for above the rim, it's the only situation here where the similarities were greater than the differences. The other 2 had more unique topics than there were similarities. Going on to the top votes that were received, GCS chose hiking, connectivity, education, native ecosystems, and seeps and springs as the top values in the Grand Canyon. The GGCLA chose springs and seeps, wilderness, natural disturbance regimes, large intact ecosystems, and native fish and wildlife. As you can see, springs and seeps were the only value across both workshops that were voted as a top value. Native ecosystems and large intact ecosystems could be seen to be the same thing. However, GCS voted this as a below the rim value, whereas GGCLA voted that as an above the rim value, making these 2 different values. Moving on to threats discussed by both workshops, using the same Venn diagram approach for discussions, you can see here that there wasn't a single instance where there were more similarities between the groups than there were differences. But going on to the top threats voted upon by the groups, coal mining, uranium mining, overcrowding, Grand Canyon Dam, and development at both above the rim and river corridor were the top threats that GCS chose. GGCLA chose altered hydrologic regimes, industrialization, invasive species, groundwater withdrawal, and recreational demands for their top threats. There is not a single similarity for the threats between the 2 workshops here. So, in summary of the results, there were some similarities between the groups when it came to values. There was the top value of springs and seeps that were considered, as well as the one instance where there were more similarities in discussion than there were differences for above the rim. However, even though there were some similarities, these really don't account for much, as these are very minimal similarities. Looking at the threats, there was quite a huge difference between the 2 workshops. The top threats did not have any similarities, and there was no point where the discussions were more similar than different. And as I said before, the Grand Canyon semester students are a group of educated students that have been studying this region from a broad perspective. So having such a gap between the understanding of values and threats between the Grand Canyon semester students and the stakeholders, one can imagine that the gap between the public and the stakeholders would be even larger. So overall, if this were to be done with a sample of the public, I would assume that the general public has a different set of values and understanding of threats to the Grand Canyon region. So what does this mean? From this information, the values and threats recognized by both GCS and the GGCLA were different, representing that the stakeholders might not necessarily represent what the public is feeling about the Grand Canyon. As the public is a huge support for the national park system through financially and politically, yet their interests may not be being met, or there's a lack of education on the part of what is either valuable or what is a threat to the region. So how do we close this gap between the public or educated groups such as Grand Canyon Semester and the stakeholders? One solution could be involving the public directly in the stakeholder process. However, there are some huge problems with this. On one hand, there's no guarantee that the public has enough education to provide informative input on the management decisions for the national park. On the other hand, these kind of processes take lots of time, money, and are extremely complicated. Adding the public to this process would only increase all of those factors. However, I propose that management would include focus groups similar to the workshop that I did with GCS. This would provide two benefits that I recognize for the national park system and the stakeholders. One would be expanding perceptions, and the other would increase education. So, for expanding perceptions, if a workshop was held with the public, the Park Service and the stakeholders might find a value or a threat that the public recognizes that was completely overlooked by stakeholders. This would take something like this and possibly turn it into that. This would increase ideas and reduce gaps in management. In addition to that, the other benefit is education, which I believe is actually the most important benefit to this. This would allow the park to see the gaps and the lack of education that the public has. For example, if there was a workshop conducted and the public did not find the endangered humpback chub to be of value, the park could see this and increase their education efforts on the humpback chub. This would lead to increased public support, both politically and financially, on the protection of that value. In today's society is very different than it was in 1916 when the National Park Service was created. It's no longer a top-down style management, and even though the stakeholder process has balanced this out, public involvement is becoming more and more important in today's society. With an increasingly changing environment and increased public engagement in government processes, involving the public alongside scientists and stakeholders in management processes encourages a balance of information and knowledge. In an age of technology, where the spread of information is unprecedented, it's important to make sure that the public is educated, involved, and engaged with our national park system to ensure that the continuation of Grand Canyon National Park as a place of unlimited value. Oh my gosh, Colleen.
Okay, so on those Venn diagrams, I noticed you had some asterisks by some of the numbers.
Yes.
What were those?
Okay, I knew that was going to come up. It was like I was planning that question to happen. So sometimes there were instances where the Grand Canyon Semester students would come up with, say, 3 or 4 different topics, but the GGCLA group combined all of those as a single topic. So I had a hard time directly matching things up. So that means that there were 16 topics of GCS that matched topics of GGCLA. So it's not necessarily that it was 16 on both sides that matched. Yeah.
So how can you take that, the survey that you have been, how can you bring that to the public to get the public's opinion? Or is that possible at all?
Sorry, what do you?
You know, like how you had us do different surveys and get our opinion?
So how would we conduct that with the public?
Yeah, how can you get that to the public?
I'm not an expert on public surveys, but I know that similar public surveys are done. I remember Angie mentioning that she was a part of something. I don't know. Never mind. Well, it would have to be a random sample that was well representative of the public.
Would be the focus group thing?
Yes.
Yeah, so I did participate as a participant, not as a survey facilitator, in a
Yes,
focus
that's right.
group where they basically invited a small group of people that represent a cross section of society. And so I was like the single girl who lives downtown demographic. And then we all sat at a table and contributed our opinions about why we did or did not vote for a certain ballot measure. So you can kind of do these focus groups where you pluck people from
From
cross section
yeah.
of people.
Making sure that you hit all the demographics. Sure.
What were your parameters for defining terms that each group used? Because especially in threats, we had said development was an issue above the rim, and they had said industrialization is a threat above the rim, and to me, those are more or less equitable.
Yes, when it's simplified terms, but when I was looking at the data, the industrialization included very different things. I can't remember the specific parameters, but I run into that issue a lot when I was like, oh my gosh, are these two things the same or different? A lot of times I just had to either email Sasha about it or I had to make my own decision about it. But in that case, the industrialization was very much defined and it did not fit what you guys define development as.
Because there are some benefits as well that were a little, they were so similar, but I guess you did it for.
Yeah.
Who created the survey? Because the questions can determine the answers.
Survey.
It's like the exercise that you did with us and that was done at the stakeholder meeting. Like who came up with this stuff?
This is Sasha's project in the back, and Tom's. She was the grad mentor that I followed around like a puppy dog. And I basically, followed the same process that she did and just organizing. It was actually pretty simple to do. And then for those of you that were not at this workshop that I conducted, at the end, I facilitated a lot of discussion questions, and those were really just what came off the top of my head. So.
This is more of just like a personal question for you, but I'm assuming that maybe what inspired you to want to do this project is when you were at the UCLA workshop, that there were things that didn't appear on that list that you were like, hey, I would have had this on this list. What were you expecting to find from us that was different, and did your results match up to your?
You guys surprised me on what you guys talked about. I was expecting, since the Grand Canyon semester students had just at this point finished up ecology, I thought there was going to be a lot more of an ecology focus to the values and threats, but actually, because I kept reiterating to people, this is what you value and this is what you think is a threat, a lot of what came up was actually public services in the park.
More like recreation.
Yeah.
And it was also right after the river trip.
And it was also right after the river trip.
One of the things that strikes me as very interesting about that whole sense of threat is that one of the largest threats is way away from the Grand Canyon itself, namely the reallocation of the Colorado River water among the states.
Yeah.
You want to mention that as a specific topic?
Not as a specific topic, no. Yeah, hydrologic alteration could be considered that, but not specifically that. Yeah. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce the extremely awesome Miss Clara Nibbelink, who will be talking about badass babes in the Southwest.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Yeah. Okay. Hi, how you doing?
Good.
My name's Clara Nibbelink. I am a geography major at the University of Georgia, and soon, hopefully, to be a woman in the media major, which I'm making up myself. My topic is called Women of the Western Wilderness. There's some alliteration for you. I was interested in how women who engage in outdoor professions and lifestyles create their own unique sense of place and sense of identity in the West. So before we do anything, I want everyone to close their eyes. We did this on the river trip, sorry you guys. And just imagine one of your favorite places in the world. And when you open your eyes, I want you to tell me how it makes you feel or how you think it shaped you. Raise your hand. Let's go. Angie.
It makes me feel warm and cinnamon.
Ooh, excellent.
Makes me feel strong.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm providing my full identity for who I am.
Oh my gosh.
I feel like flying.
That's perfect. Okay. 2 more. Huh?
Connected.
Yes.
Extremely large and extremely small at the same time.
Very open.
That's excellent. You guys had great answers. A+. So places shape our identities. Places act on people just as people act on places. This is a quote by Southwestern writer Terry Tempest Williams, who focuses on place. She argues for a geography of the self, which is basically an argument for self-identity that's cued and shaped by the land. So some places, like the West, have a lot of wilderness, and this evokes a certain kind of sense of place and identity that we'll talk about. All right, so first I want you to take a look at this map. This is Flagstaff, and this is Flagstaff proper, and here's outside of Flagstaff. It's beautiful, it's green. Okay, now this is Athens, Georgia. This is Athens proper, and then this is outside of Athens. As you can see, there's a whole lot of development outside of Athens and a whole lot of wilderness outside of Flagstaff. Granted, the population sizes are a bit different. This is 60,000, this is around 100,000, but still, that's measuring inside the city, and you've got all this development outside. So, if we think that wilderness is the formation of self, it would kind of make sense that more of this wilderness-esque sense of place would happen in the West, because actually 78% of designated wilderness areas are west of the Mississippi River. So, Terry Tempest Williams also has another quote for this. She talks about the desert. Every pilgrimage to the desert is a pilgrimage to the self. There's no place to hide, and so we are found. Okay, so I want to talk about how these wilderness areas can create a sense of place that might be innovative or liberating, especially for women in the West. So my thesis was that, do I have a slide? Yeah. My thesis was that women in the West developed this unique sense of place and associated identity that is A, historically contingent on women before them, women who migrated to the West. That's B, actually contingent on the landscape itself, the fact that there's so much wilderness out here that you can engage in and recreate with and look at the big open skies. And this sense of place is also kind of embodied in movement with the land and through the land. You're not just walking your dog through the park, you're going on these backpacking excursions, you're going river running. And then finally, that this sense of place is potentially revolutionary if you're thinking about progress, women's movements and women's progress, because women can actually be free, active agents in this land. So let's talk about a little bit of background. Sensing place. Places are not open spaces onto which you pour humanity and language and culture, even though that happens, because people do act on places. But places also give something back to you. You absorb some of their placeness in you, and you take that with you as you go. So why is wilderness and why is sensing place important for women? Let's talk about manifest destiny. This is the period between the War of 1812 and somewhat after the Civil War of 1865, in which people were migrating westward. And this history is largely a male-dominated history. It's about men coming to the gold rush in California. It's about men going to the Oregon Trail. It's about men basically populating the West. But actually, there were a lot of women who came too. And as these women migrated west, as wives, as mothers, as daughters, sometimes they even homesteaded together. Two sisters would come together and homestead. Their lives changed drastically with the landscape. So I want you guys to imagine what a typical Wild West woman is, and will you shout out that image in your head for me?
Cowgirl.
Yeah. Anything else? Someone had a great
Pioneer
one.
woman.
Yes.
Little House on the Prairie.
I don't think mine's good. Do you remember it?
Prostitute? I do remember it. That was your suggestion. But yeah, so these are the images we have from women in the West. And this actually, your images align with the ones that scholars and academics talk about. This is these are two like dichotomous images. This one is kind of opposite of this one. So this is supposed to be the gentle tamer. This is the woman who comes with her husband west and she civilizes the land while he attacks the land. But the gentle tamer has a shovel, so she's clearly also engaging with the landscape as a farmer or a rancher. And then you have Annie Oakley, who's the best sharpshooter in the West, and she shoots just as well as, if not better than, some men. So you've got these two women who are sort of supposed to be complete opposites in this history of women's images, but they actually both engage actively with the landscape. Here's just a couple more images. These are cowgirls, and these are the first women in Colorado to actually recreate and climb mountains in their big skirts. What I think is really interesting about this history of migration of women to the West is that you start getting these actual women and these images of women in active positions, in positions where they're just as strong as men and just as capable. So you've got that onto this Western template of the land. Okay, so here's the thing. Women today still have self-esteem issues and confidence issues when you're comparing them to men. And there are studies done in gender journals and in outdoor recreation journals on how outdoor recreation affects women. Okay, so I have a little formula for you guys, for all you math-brained people, to figure it out. You take a girl who's sad because society has limited her. You give her a backpack. And then you multiply that by a mountain. Then you have a girl on top of a mountain who is happy and feels confident in herself and in her sense of place. Her backpack, she left it by the, I don't know. And then just to remind you that this sense of place, or the one that I'm talking about specifically, is more possible in the West right now because of all the wilderness areas that we have out here. Okay, so I wanted to investigate this. I wanted to investigate really whether the West really was a template for this new sense of place and identity that women have. So I interviewed 5 women in the Flagstaff Grand Canyon area. Oh, analysis. That's us. We're women setting up a tent. Okay. This is Marika Tanny. She is a Grand Canyon river guide, and she works in the NAU Parks and Recreation Department. She also teaches a class on women in the outdoors and women in gender studies. She's from Flagstaff. This is Pam Fody. She also teaches the Women in the Outdoors class. She's the one who created it. She also teaches in Parks and Recreation. She's originally from Ohio, but she came to Grand Canyon when she was in college and fell in love and has been a Grand Canyon backpacker ever since. This is Emma Wharton. She is the director of Grand Canyon Youth and a river guide. She actually got her master's in social work, so she's used to working with kids. She grew up in Utah. And this is Debbie Brenchley. She's a search and rescue ranger at Grand Canyon National Park. This is her hanging out of a helicopter. Pretty awesome. She grew up in Washington. And this is Christy Sorrell. Christy is the hazard tree coordinator at Grand Canyon National Park. Some of you from service might recognize her with the chainsaw. She came from Pennsylvania. Okay, so the first thing I was looking at is the West a template and how? And what I found was that women had to be in the West to start developing the sense of outdoor place and sense of identity that they had. And I did this by comparing the women who'd migrated west to the women who'd grown up in the West. So I've got a few telling quotes here. Christy Sorrell, who migrated west, talked about seeing these images of mountains and of bighorn sheep in the landscape and how they represented freedom to her. And when she came west, it was the first time she really felt free. She also mentioned something about it being a new identity and how she loved that new identity for herself. This is a quote from Pam, who talked about never really thinking about engaging in the outdoors until college when she took a trip to the Grand Canyon, and that changed her life. So coming west was huge for her. But the ladies who had grown up in the West never had that big moment of feeling free or connected or capable to the landscape because they always felt that way. So, so you've got Debbie Brenchley, who said that becoming a search and rescue ranger sort of just came naturally to her because she'd always known how to hike and ski and climb, and she'd grown up doing that. Emma Wharton always loved being outside. And then this is interesting. Marika Tanny talked about, I asked her if she ever felt unwelcome in the outdoors or in male-dominated positions, and she said, no, I've never felt like that because I've been in these positions my whole life, so I've never had a problem being accepted as a woman. So I found that being in the West, at least for these women, was really essential in starting to create this identity in this place. And I thought Christy Sorrell just summed it up pretty well. She said she found men interact with women so differently out here because they're used to women being tough and capable. And I found that in my own experience as well, since I moved from Wyoming, as you all know, to Georgia. Had to encounter boys in high school who are terrible. So the next thing I was looking at was how do women sense wilderness? How do they actively feel this? So I want you guys to do an activity with me. Everyone please stand if you are able. All right, now I just want you to groove, okay? Just groove. Go this way, not this way. That's nice. All right, now listen to what I'm saying because it's super interesting. Okay, so the most salient aspect of place, you feel that through movement, through the journey. So when you're going into place or through place or out of place, you're moving around in place, you're feeling it in 4 dimensions. You're smelling it, you're dancing around in it. It's great. And to prove this to you, you're all going to remember this part of the presentation later because you were moving while it was happening. Everyone have Okay. So it turns out there is a crucial interaction between body, place, and motion, and it's actually empowering for women to be moving through places with their own power, as opposed, as I was saying before, backpacking and climbing as opposed to walking around in the city. So instead of being a passive woman on the fainting couch going about for a turn in the garden, you're an intense woman who's rowing down a river. That's Ari. Okay, so I've got some quotes to back this up. I thought Marika said it best. I asked her when she felt best, and she said, it's when I'm on the river. Because I'm looking around in my boat, people are smiling, I'm in this place that I love, and I'm feeling humbled by the ability to move through a place by my own power. And I think this sort of goes back to what Kyle said. You feel big and small at the same time. I think that's really profound, that you can feel humbled by the landscape but powerful at the same time. So let's talk about what wilderness gives to you. What does wilderness actually give to these women? Why should we recreate in the outdoors? I think Debbie Brenchley said it best. She said, that whole recreation thing, I sometimes think of it as recreation. You get this opportunity to recreate your life, reestablish it with what's really essential. So the way I think of that for women is you can go out in the wilderness and be apart from all those messages that society is sending you, and you can sort of reestablish life with what you want and get back to basics. There's also another component to this, is that wilderness allows you to just be yourself and be excited to be there. Marika said this beautifully. I asked her what was the first word she thought of when I said Grand Canyon or Colorado River, and she immediately said brilliance. She said, I think I see brilliance in a lot of people down there because you're seeing people in their raw form, and that's really beautiful. But she also said, I feel brilliance within myself just with being at peace with who I am and where I am. And then the canyon, of course, is brilliant. I think that's really profound. Okay, so let's conclude. Why is the study important? It's because women are still having these issues with confidence and with self-esteem and with feeling like they're capable and being able to engage with these landscapes. But if you, as evidenced by these 5 women, if you put them in the outdoors, something beautiful will happen, something magical, something where they find strength in themselves, and I think that's really awesome. And this is just one facet of, if you want to call it women's progress or even feminism. Some of these women don't even identify as feminists, but it's just one facet of it, but it's really working. It's a way to find your own strength apart from what people tell you to do. So I would encourage you guys to look for your own landscapes and places where you can connect with and where you can feel your own best self. And I know that I'll do that. When I go back to Georgia, I'm going to carry these messages from my research and from Grand Canyon semester and from this landscape with me. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
If you ever wanted to extend that study a bit, it'd be very interesting for you to talk to some native women, perhaps especially some native women who have been here
Yeah.
for a good 1,000 years or more,
That-
and who live and make enough for society.
That's an excellent point. That's something I didn't put in my presentation, but I did limit my study to Euro-American women because they were the women that I had found to interview, and I felt I wasn't capable at that moment of doing a complete multicultural study of women in the West. So I just focused on migration, Euro-American migration. But yeah, that's excellent. I would definitely do that if I expanded the study. Any other questions?
I think you could also build upon this in other regions. I know, like you said, you're going to Africa and spring break, and
Yeah.
you can just
I am, aren't I?
applying this to different regions and seeing
Mhm.
how different cultures as well, it shapes how we can really like portray themselves and
Mhm.
beyond this just like geographic region, but also culture plays into it as well.
Yeah, and I know something that I wanted to do that I couldn't in the time that we had was in the place where we were, is I would like to be able to compare it to the East where I live and actually do a study there, and of course sample more women, sample multicultural women, and then even a study comparing men and women would be really interesting. But the reason I chose the outdoors in particular is the nature of the semester. It's focused on experiential learning in the outdoors, but also because the outdoors is sort of like the final frontier. It's the place where men are men, you know? And so I really thought it would be interesting to find it as a place where women are women. Yeah. Yeah.
Has doing this project changed your outlook on your own relationship with the outdoors?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I feel like when I moved from Wyoming to Georgia, as you all know, I felt a little like the opposite of what these women migrating west were feeling. Like I felt a little more trapped and disempowered. But I think now that I've gone through this semester and realized, you know, you have to kind of put your own effort in and kind of go into the outdoors yourself. Like I asked Marika, do you think that it's important for women to have role models in the West and that all this migration happened so that there's people here who actually did it before you? And she said, yeah, I think that's important, but I think it's also just important that you do it yourself, that you have the desire to do it. So I think definitely it's affected me that when I go back home, I'm not going to just sit there in my room feeling trapped because I'm in Georgia. I'm going to try and go out and engage with the wilderness and take advantage of those opportunities. Yes?
Was there a time during the semester when you did feel that sense of empowerment, a particular time or event
Yeah, I think there's many, many times this semester, but I can think of one, and that would be wolf packing during our backpacking trip. For all of you who don't know, wolf packing is standing naked on top of a mountain. Any more? Okay, now we'll have a short break followed by Vanessa Alejandro.